I have the faith vocabulary, and if you live in America and are sensitive to your faith being part of a bigger part of culture, I also want to say the formation for me as a Catholic in the 60s and 70s, even though I lived very insular on the Irish side of town, Catholic side of town, is ecumenism. So I knew how to inquire and speak, and it's primarily Methodist, and there are a lot of churchgoers.
That was the voice of Marybeth Shea, technical writer and Irish-American voice from America's Mountain West. And I'm Martin Nutty.
And I'm John Lee. Welcome back to our latest Global Irish Nation conversation here on Irish Stew. This episode is sponsored by Shantella, your all-in-one business launchpad in the United States. Committed to excellence and execution, Shantella helps enterprises enter or expand in the U.S. market through bespoke project management and strategic planning solutions. Create and realize your vision with Shantella, where they invest their passion in your future success. To learn more, go to shantella.space. Yes, .space. It's a thing. Hey, welcome back, everyone, to the latest episode of Irish Stew. I think we're going to have a very wide-ranging conversation in store for us today as we go from Montana to Maryland and maybe to the mob. Martin?
So, yes, indeed, John, that's kind of a nice tease, and we will see what is revealed in this conversation. But our next guest describes herself as a humanist and cites her Catholic education, specifically the Jesuits, as being foundational to her career and worldview. She comes to us from the state of Maryland, but originates from America's Mountain West, most notably Montana, with a stop in California along that journey. She's an educator who understands the importance of bridging the gap between scientific specialists and the general public through the medium of technical communication. She is a professor of English in the professional writing program at the University of Maryland. And with all that, welcome to Irish Stew, Marybeth Shea.
So nice to see and hear both of you in a conversation.
So, Marybeth, thanks for coming on. We're going to kick this off. I want to place you a little bit. So, do you see yourself more as a person of the high plains of the American West or of the Chesapeake Bay area in the East Coast on the Atlantic? Are you sea or are you mountain?
So you know what? I get to say both, but I'm going to tell you my inner self is much more the Mountain West. And there are times when I still say, I'm from Montana. And then my brain goes, you've been in Maryland since 1983. The magnificence of the Mountain West, and if you don't know it, the absolute magnificence of the Chesapeake Bay is helpful. And I love that there's a big geography close to me. And my Western family is shocked when I tell them I have more immediate experiences of nature in my urban setting. Quick bike ride, and I'm on the Anacostia River. And I have kayaked, and I've also biked to the Potomac. Potomac is actually a big, scary river. But yeah, so both. But my inner landscape is still totally the Mountain West.
I'm reminded of the Jesuitical take, give me the child for 7 years and I will give you the man. And it seems like certainly more than your first 7 years were shaped by the landscapes of Montana and the people of Montana. Is that consistent with your viewpoint that we never really escaped the tyranny of our origin points?
Yeah, and I hope it's not just a tyranny. I hope it's also sort of a frame. But there's usually suffering in every person's childhood, so that kind of makes sense. And I would just say that it's perhaps not understood as much by us in the U.S. West as it is by maybe Canadians, that the Jesuits have this huge footprint on the West. I mean, early explorers were French Jesuits, and also in Montana, there was an Italian Jesuit who ended up in the same time. Yeah, definitely. And I would also say I have throughout my entire life said that the Jesuit motto of men for others, they don't mind. I go, people for others and women for others too. And it is a formation. And I so appreciate it.
Of all the people that we've had on the podcast, certainly that would fall under the Irish American diaspora. My sense is that you probably have a better understanding of your deep family history than just about anybody else we've had on.
I was mentioning, my grandparents came over, and I don't even know that much about them, and that's not too long ago.
Well, I remember your genealogist person, and her name is escaping me for the moment.
Bridget Bray?
Yeah, the genealogy piece and the DNA part opens up all kinds of horizons. And then something that I'm not sure is so active in the East, but if you end up with a Mormon downline in your family tree, oh my God, you're going to hear about it and they're going to inquire of you pretty intensely. And the West is a big place. I have thought a lot about why some people stay Catholic and maybe have an Irish identity. I'm going to throw a bone to that little helper. She can tell I'm excited and happy.
It wouldn't be an episode without a dog, a cat, a siren.
Super. Right. So Mormons do this out of one of their faith obligations. And you may know that they also go back and retroactively baptize you or ordinance you, which, but I would also say the DNA piece has been absolutely astonishing. And I kind of encourage it for people who care about it, but would also say you're going to find things. Nobody can keep a secret anymore with DNA stuff. Even if you think everyone in your family's not going to do it, it's going to sneak out. So, and it's possible that if you're out in the West, maybe you do latch onto it and choose to study it. I'm going to say there's some intensity and unevenness about Irish identity. It might be more carried in a family and in a particular set of families at a parish, as opposed to in the East. I see it out here because I live here now. You can say, oh yeah, people have been here for 9 generations. They all know who each other are.
So speaking of your family genealogy, where does that come from in terms of interest? Was that something that was important to you, or was it handed down to you? In other words, that narrative around family.
So there were always the stories that came directly from parents, grandparents, and some aunties and uncles. And I'm one of 63 grandchildren on one side. So we're quite legion in a couple of generations. But somehow the older, and it tend to be ladies, the older ladies in your family who would come together for funerals and weddings, mostly funerals. I don't know why, would show up to the funerals. They would kind of see you, and someone would say, Marybeth likes history. You need to start grooming her into history. And not everybody cares. I would say my siblings, they just go, okay. There's only one who cared recently in a big way, and he's a recently retired Navy SEAL. He's in his 50s. He should have been retired a while ago. And he said, and he showed me, he goes, I'm doing a tattoo for the family history. And I was the consultant. And he honored one thing. I said, the women's names get lost. And he goes, oh yeah, because they get married. And I say, and guess what? They're also the mothers of warriors. And that made him go, okay, I want to hold up some names. And he actually held up 2 grand matrilineal names, and I was kind of thrilled, but he did it because they are the mother of warriors.
Yeah, when I talk about genealogy, I always kind of refer to the fact, we tend to be a little obsessed by the last name that we are born with or carry with us. And it's only just a very, very slim portion of one's history. So a legacy, I suppose, of, primogenitor or something like that, where this last name is supposed to be hugely important. And I don't think it really is.
Well, and here's where I can say it was an option, but it was so upsetting to everybody. I didn't change my name when I married. And people were upset. And then my dad kind of said, well, you'd be becoming a Scandinavian name. And he goes, okay, so keep your name. Because the upper Midwest, Wisconsin and Minnesota, it's all a stereotype. But Garrison Keillor was telling very true stories, and that's the origin of those families. And by the way, there are a lot of Norwegians in Montana, more so than Swedes. I don't really know why that is. But so my dad's identity piece sort of overcame that. What? They're going to think you're not married and having kids. Respectability here. But he kind of decided it was okay. So, and I'm no longer married, and it's just been so utterly great to just have this continuous name.
Yep. I'm an uncle of 9 nieces, and so I'm somewhat sensitive to that particular issue. Although with my last name, I think there's more than a few in my family that would be delighted to get rid of it. But actually, they choose not to because it is, as you point out, unlike Sullivan or Murphy, it is quite a unique identifier. And once people come to a realization that Nutty is actually my last name, they never forget it.
No, it's actually quite good. And it's easy to pronounce. Shea is fine now because of shea butter on the commercials. But before that, as you can imagine.
Also, Martin's name is more searchable than mine. Quite a few John Lees in the world. So
yeah, and Lee has a storied heritage in the U.S. that you're either part of or not, or you don't know. So
yeah, and also it's strangely such a common name in China and Korea. So I've been in situations where people expected to meet a Korean, and then I walk in, because 20% of them are named Lee. So
disappointed.
Yep. Sorry about that.
But I'm not sure what the best way is to talk about your Montana heritage, because what you told me is fascinating. First of all, as I understand your family migration to America, none of them came through the traditional ports of New York and Boston or even, Philadelphia.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that. You can pick out people because it's such a huge history. We can't possibly talk about it.
So there are probably people who came into those ports, but they didn't stay. But the ones that are more, what's weird is sometimes the mother stuff comes down in the stories, which can be a companion to, okay, here's a patrilineal name. But my mother's family almost always, they just marched across Canada and after the U.S. Civil War, slipped in through Chicago, which is another storied Irish place. But guess what? They didn't stay. And it was the homesteading westward expansion. And I want to say that my mom's family always had more literacy. And I'm not really sure why, but, literacy is a great gift. It allows you to read things and it allows you to write letters. And westward expansion, and they heard about that thing that was either a scam or, they could get in on a land grab. And my mom's family was in eastern South Dakota by 1888 and land claims. And they couldn't hardly believe it, right? If you live on the land. And then there were related tree claims. There was this vision we could forest the West. Didn't work so well. They went, and they also brought a bunch of people with them because of the literacy. And it was embodied in a woman named Mary Kelly, who married a Tobin. So Tobin is a real strong patrilineal name in my mom's family. And they kind of trusted her because she had been writing letters back and forth for people for probably 20 years. And also, here's where American history gets amazing, is my grandfather's family, the Tobins, homesteaded with the McGoverns, George McGovern of the presidential run. Yeah. They homesteaded together and they proved each other's claims. They had to give witness that they were there all winter long, sleeping in a dugout. Yeah. And actually, George McGovern was in Washington when I lived here. And when I was introduced to him, he pulled my arm in and he goes, "Oh, I know exactly whose daughter you are."
Oh, amazing.
And it was great. And the other people are looking at me and I'm kind of going, yeah, family ties.
That's incredible.
Yeah, my dad's side is interesting. There's one Civil War person and we don't know where he came from. He could have been in Philadelphia and ended up out west. Civil War could get you there. But the intentional recruitment by silver first gold, then silver, and then copper was the, manifest mineral in Montana. They recruited in the Beira Peninsula. They also recruited in Cornwall, and Devon. So, but they brought people through New Orleans. It was cheaper, but also the rivers are the super highways, and you go up the river steamboat as far as you can, and then you walk, and then you wagon, and then you walk. So his family ended up in Montana, and then I explained they went back and forth, and people sometimes think, why didn't they just like stop halfway between Kansas, Leavenworth, Kansas, and, Silver Bow, Butte, Montana? And there was not much in there. And that is some of the harshest territory ever. I mean, when you look at the pictures of National Geographic, you would go, that's something to be endured, probably not to settle in. And the jumping back and forth between the military and mining, that was pretty common for those families.
Marybeth, did you have a chance? I know you're one of our, very quickly have become one of our most loyal listeners and have listened to almost every podcast, but did you come across the episode we did with Jim Walsh and Damian Shields?
Did not
Leadville,
that one.
Yeah, so that was the Jim Walsh part. He's a professor from Colorado, and it was about his research into the Irish of Leadville, Colorado, which I think was the highest altitude incorporated city in America, some designation like that. Heavily Irish, mining, silver mines, I believe it was. And they even had a visit from Oscar Wilde.
Oh my God.
It became quite an elegant little city with an opera house, even though there's barely enough oxygen to breathe up there. And anyway, so when that mining fell apart, my sense is a lot of those miners probably did migrate up towards Butte, Montana, and the mining going on there.
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure that Unsinkable Molly Brown, who was a Tobin, but probably not ours, that's where she is from. That's where she is from, and that's where her wealth occurred in order to be on the Titanic and then also survive the Titanic.
Yeah, it was interesting because he actually, Jim Walsh, that is, when we were talking about Leadville, he cited the town of Allihies, which is on the very western tip of the Barra Peninsula, as where a lot of the miners came from. And that was actually a mining center. And that's only actually come clear to me recently from a lot of the reading that I've done about Ireland, was there was quite a lot of mining and smelting going on in Ireland. Why? Because Ireland used to have a lot of woodland, and they were using that as fodder to basically, smelt the metal from the ore that they had extracted. So there's this long tradition of mining, but it's non-existent in Ireland anymore. But you see it playing out in Colorado, and obviously you see it playing out in Butte. But let's do this. Let's talk a little bit about Butte. Were you actually born in the city or just in the general area? And tell our listeners a little bit about Butte itself, because I've heard it described as the most Irish city in the United States.
All right. So I was actually born in Germany because of the American military. But quickly back into Montana, we always lived in Great Falls, which was you mine in Butte, and they did small scale smeltering, but it was mountain towns. Real estate is a premium because you're on high, So Great Falls is on the edge of the plains. So they moved to Great Falls. There's also a river, which is going to give you your power, and also the forest, because you have to burn. In the first stages, you had to burn to the level of charcoal to get these hot, it's kind of like barbecue mastery. So we were in Great Falls. And here's what's interesting is aspirational people wanted to leave Butte because Butte was just devastating. Great Falls, it was easier to have a factory job than to have a mining job. You were not going into the ground. But we visited Butte a lot, and we have many, it's a big name, so no one's getting called out. I mean, Sullivan, you guys know that. There's a lot of Sullivan and Sheehy's and Shea's all there, and they can pretend to know each other or not. We did go my dad would let us go into the opening places of the pubs. And then he would go, well, we're not going to stay because there's not a good element here.
Right.
And then we would go to, Butte is not just Irish. Butte was, even more so than California population-wise, had a huge influx of incredibly brave Chinese people, to just go, okay, we'll do whatever you want. Mine, lumber. And the oldest continuously operating Chinese restaurant in the country is in Butte, still operating. It's called Pekin. They go by the local accent. It's called Pekin Noodle Parlor. And we would go there because it was not the whiskey place.
Yeah, I did a little bit of reading. I know there are a lot of Italians there, and as you mentioned, Scandinavians. We have just one other episode with a woman in St. Paul, Minnesota, Natalie Nugent O'Shea, who started an amazing Celtic Junction. And she told us about the Irish there, which I never really associated, I always think of Scandinavians. But there was an area called the Connemara Patch where the Irish settled. So we heard that story. And I'm sure some of them migrated out towards Montana at some point as well.
It did. You guys would be shocked at how much, in the old-fashioned word, intercourse there is between these major metropolitan areas. But also, F. Scott Fitzgerald's mother was a McQuillan from St. Paul, Minnesota. And we're actually related to them, too. But yeah, so McQuillan is one of the big names in Minnesota, and of course gives rise to F. Scott Fitzgerald. His Fitzgerald name comes from Maryland, of all places, and been here like since 1690. So yeah, a son of St. Paul is one of our iconic American writers.
Is kind of comparing my Irish American experience. My grandparents came from Ireland, but we didn't really grow up we were more like that sort of Irish Catholic identity. There weren't any Cayleys, there weren't any tin whistles, there weren't any Irish dance classes. I'm sure it existed, but just wasn't part of our world. Were those aspects of Irishness part of your upbringing?
In a much lighter way, there wasn't a collection of people to do live music, so we had scratchy records, okay? We did some Irish, it's not so much step dancing, we would do the sets, which I found out much later. Well, this is where square dancing comes from.
Exactly.
We would do the sets, and we would be in the church basement. And I think, that my nuns were not Irish. The priests were mostly Irish. The nuns were Quebecois. And they would do this, and I sometimes think they were like, fine, Tuesday will be Irish Dance Day in the multipurpose room. And it was kind of like, fine, have your culture. And little old ladies came and did it. And they would kind of do this thing where, it sounds terrible, but the pointers, the old-fashioned pointers at school point to the chalkboard. They would tap our arms because we weren't that Irish. We didn't know that the arms were supposed to be affixed to your legs. Because, once that music gets going and you start doing the little jig step, your arms kind of want to do this. And they were like, no. Irish is arms down. It's only the feet.
And that's kind of been disrupted since River Dance. It's gotten to be a much freer form and, much more international and global. And I'm going to mention the word global a little bit, but we've got you in Montana. We started off in Germany somehow, but we got you in Montana. And now, what are the steps that led you to what you do now, your academic work, your professional work in Maryland? What's your trail from Montana to Maryland?
So there's an Irish education scaffolding, and I probably was raised under the better pieces of it. It was not a residential school. We were not in the fancy parish. We were in a parish kind of by accident. You know how in the olden days your address dictated your parish? Nobody went to another one, and you couldn't get your baptisms. We had 7 kids. You couldn't get any of that stuff done. So we were in our parish, and I remember my mom looking at it, moving there from Germany and going, oh my God, I think Marybeth might be going to a French school. And this was not a time when families were looking for a bilingual opportunity. And I think my mom tried to figure out what was going on, and everyone goes, it's just the nuns. They're French. It's in English. And she went, okay, it's going to be fine. But we were not the cool school in terms of aspiring Irish. We were French Canadian in that time. And in that area probably meant you were mixed race. And many of them were of a group of Indians who were completely landless. Not every band said, I'm signing a treaty with Canada. Okay, now I got to sign a treaty with the US. So they were landless, and many of them lived on U.S. land in just horrific conditions. But they came to the school. They were not residents. And I often think with the residential school scandals, there may have been something like, all right, we'll go to school, but you're coming home at night, including to some trailers. Trailers in Montana are really hard. And these Quebec...
Excuse me, Marybeth, what's the trailers?
So can you imagine living in a trailer heated by propane on the Montana winter? And there were also shanties half dug into hills.
Right, gotcha, okay. And
somehow, miraculously, because they see when you get to the west, the edge of the city is totally the country. And people would sort of gather themselves. Some of these kids would ride on horses. There were some horses for the first few years of my going to school tied in the playground. So these were incredibly impoverished people, but who also had probably since like 1680, their families had connections to Catholicism and intermarriage with the French. And these Quebecois nuns, Quebec, they were like, their mission was out on the prairie to serve. And then they went to Montana because there were these small bands of people who culturally are maybe more French than Anglo. So my high school, my elementary school and first part of high school were dominated by that, which turns out to be an absolutely huge sort of accidental experience in multiculturalism. I didn't do the Pledge of Allegiance in a school until I moved to California. And it's not like the nuns were against it, but it wasn't in their playbook.
Right.
It also meant that we had friends who were tribal, and my dad, who was really kind of a person born to be in the mountains, did things with them. He also would, in his somewhat Teddy Roosevelt, but also sensitive way, if you can believe that, he made sure that they had immunizations along the same pathway as the townies. He also did it with the Hutterites, which is an Anabaptist Amish community that live in a kibbutz setting and use technology, but live more simply. So we went on amazing, I had amazing fishing and hunting experiences with tribal people. And back to the education piece, whatever it was tried and true Catholic education that probably stems from medieval times. And I was really afraid when I got to California and thought I would be so behind. And I would just go, oh my God, no, this old-fashioned thing worked. Yeah. And it was also the Jesuits. I went to school with the Jesuits in California.
And what grabbed you at that level of education? What started you on your professional path when you were in college?
Accident. Remember the olden days when you had little 3x5 cards and you went and registered and got stamps? I came in and said, well, I like sciences or like humanities. I want to do both. Nobody grabbed me. So I just kept marching through, and I get to be my junior year, and a Jesuit in a long cassock, Father McCormick in physics, comes in and was mad and went, what are you doing? How are you going to graduate? Come over to the sciences or go to the humanities. And I kind of just stood there and went, I want to do both. They figured out an independent studies major for me called botany, because the history thing worked. And I graduated with an interdisciplinary degree by accident. And yet, I think the Jesuits, in their heart of hearts, can do that even then. They kind of broke a mold for me, but I'm sure it was why didn't somebody stop her when she was a sophomore?
Right. Yeah. Now I think there's probably more opportunities for interdisciplinary. Actually, I'm going to mention my daughter later on, but she had an interdisciplinary major in environmental studies. So it's science, it's law, it's policy, it's, so.
Yeah, because people in an ecological system have an outside effect, and we need these human, But how I ended up teaching at Maryland is someone else who was in there's along with diaspora, there are Catholic, started with something called the Jesuit Alumni Club. There's Georgetown in the area, but Georgetown would always say, oh, you went to Santa Clara? How nice. Because Georgetown top dog. But this person says to me, we need someone who's not afraid of science, but who can teach English. And, oh my God, you went to Santa Clara and you have this, and I've heard you talk about, he goes, just come teach for us in the English department. And it was kind of because I wasn't afraid of the science and I could do the science. But yeah, so tell your daughter, as someone who accidentally pioneered, good for her.
Well, she's right now taking courses in technical writing,
yes.
which I think is a pretty good segue into, what keeps you busy 9 to 5 in many of your days: technical writing, technical communication, professional writing. What is it, and what's your title for what you do, and where would somebody like me run across that type of work?
It's probably sort of, it's one of those things of unsung labor. But if you experience a really clear piece of communication, including in medical settings, like maybe think about how we explained how mRNA vaccines work. And think about how many people suddenly went, I didn't know viruses. Oh, this one has a spike protein, and the evil resides upon the spike protein. When that really good communication happens, almost seamlessly, there's probably been a technical communicator in there, or there's been a scientist who's kind of gifted with telling a quick, good story. The whole genesis of it is the post-war expansion of, we've had two takes at it in the U.S. First one was Civil War with the Morrill Act, one of the last things that, I almost said Kennedy.
Lincoln.
Thank you. COVID is great. You see his face and you can't say his name. He signed that into the act, and that was land in every state and territory would be reserved for a great university to beat swords into plowshares. And we were going to figure out farming and the depletion of soil. Okay, and then we sort of did the same thing World War II with the GI Bill. And it's a terrible stereotype, but it's true of all of us. Engineers, people were like shocked at how good they were at engineering, but they couldn't tell people how the gear ratios worked and why they needed a lever here and not down there, and why they needed steel plated whatever and not, aluminum.
Right.
So technical writing became a requirement in these big land grant places. So you'll find these programs mostly at the big public Ivies and the little public Ivies, where they're doing this lion's share of, you need to be able to tell your boss how that code works. Yeah, so that's sort of the impulse of it. And then I would say PBS nature shows are another unsung place for this thing called technical writing.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have these beautiful people like Carl Sagan and then Richard Attenborough, right? But they had really scores of incredibly thoughtful humanist writers behind them about how we do this story in the half an hour frame and what visuals.
You're kind of getting into another element there. We've had a lot of writers on Irish Stew, and the sort of Irish tradition of storytelling surfaces a lot. This is a very different type of storytelling, but I imagine that's a very important skill in technical writing, being able to tell a story.
No, I tell them, and my students will often get a hold of me later. I had to do something recently, and I went and calculated, and I underballed it because it was so shocking to me. I started in 87, and I'm still in the same department. I think I've had more than 6,000 students. And I hear from people, not as much, and that's okay. But when I hear from them, they always go, oh my God, my report is a narrative, and the characters in the narrative are, and it's usually a device, or even think about our cancer stories. This will help you fight the cancer, right? And we want a success story. We want to know that of the 40% who took this new kind of chemo protocol, 62% are, we don't always say cancer-free, we say are living well 5 years out. So we could make it a chronic disease. We shift from the absolute war annihilation to some sort of detente. But yes, and I want to say something about the storytelling. I had to often explain to my family with a little bit of wistfulness, because they would say, well, you always wanted to be a writer. And I go, yes, I did. Of course, it's an Irish thing. And our family elevated the books and the stories. I think I told you that my dad walked around in his tuneless way and sang these songs of Irish rebellion. So we had to focus on the words because the tune was not so great. But my family would go, but you're teaching engineers how to talk about gear ratios. And I go, yes, Mom, and that's writing. But it was kind of weird that I had to apologize a little bit. And I often have to say to students the same thing that Stephen King says and everyone else. I think Orwell said it too. Write it and then kill your darlings. If you have the word plethora in there, take it out. Write a poem about plethora, but you're not going to, But I do think that narrative and that story, because, I mean, a quick reading of Irish history is people had to accept the culture and build the culture that they could, that was hidden and oral.
Portable.
Right?
Yes, a product of a long history of impoverishment. The two things that were cheap to do became predominant, it feels to me, in Irish culture, whether that is, the literary tradition and the musical tradition. What's interesting, I suppose, in Ireland now is that poverty is no longer predominant. And what'll be interesting to see is how that actually develops and changes things. But the literary arts in Ireland continue to be very, very strong, despite that.
Just flourishing.
Yeah. But I came across a video of you where you're talking about technical writing, and you referred to a project that took place on the eastern shore. That's a little peninsula for our listeners that kind of frames one side of Chesapeake Bay. And in that video, you describe about the challenges of dealing with very conservative, both culturally and religious communities and rural communities, and how you were trying to work with them to gather some information up, I think, about chicken farming. But can you frame it out in a better way so our listeners can understand what's going on?
Yeah. And John, you're going to send this to your daughter. And if your daughter wants to contact me.
Already did.
Yeah, okay, so,
but we'll talk, we'll offline that, as we say in business.
I mean, I don't know. Fate is also a big theme in any old culture, but I think it still exists for some of us with a strong Irish identity. Fate. And I'm suddenly involved in this project with a bunch of scientists who said, oh my God, we need a humanist on the project. It's being required. Hey, Marybeth. And usually I would do that and help them write up their stuff really well and maybe go to a presentation. But this one said, a humanist scholar must be in the design of the experiment. And I ended up shifting the project a little bit because they were saying, how do we just communicate better the science to the poultry farmers? So they will choose to lower their ammonia, which is a byproduct of chicken production. It's part of chicken excrement, ammonia, that smell. It goes into the air and it's deposited on soil and on water. And it's part of our Chesapeake Bay algal bloom problem or dead zones, which every estuary, including in Ireland and Brittany and in the Gulf of Mexico, they have this farm runoff. And I remember saying, well, I think I'm going to go, we got a 4-year project. I'm going to go talk to farmers. And they kind of went, okay, Marybeth, if you want to. So I was able as an in to talk about some of my rural background and my rural understanding about living and working the land. Because farming is an extractive industry. It's got renewable pieces to it. But also we had a dairy farm set of cousins in Montana. And that helped. And I am a person, I have the faith vocabulary. And if you live in America and are sensitive to your faith being part of a bigger part of culture, I also want to say the formation for me as a Catholic in the 60s and 70s, even though I lived very insular on the Irish side of town, Catholic side of town, is ecumenism. So I knew how to sort of inquire and speak. And it's primarily Methodist. And there are a lot of churchgoers. And also there are, in the northern part, there are Amish people. Old order Mennonites, which are a little more flexible, but they have poultry farms. So I went to all these chicken dinners and people would pass me on and say, there's this nice lady from Maryland and she wants to talk to you about poultry farming. And we ended up talking about things like, are you ready? And I also did some novel survey work where people sorted cards. I didn't send them a survey link. Okay. We did sorting of cards on tables in church halls. It's very time intensive. But sometimes people would say to me, well, I want my farm to stay in production for my children. And I was able to translate that into my science friends saying, what if we talk to them about managing ammonia as a way to keep land healthy and flexible for 80 years into the future so they could see 2 generations going forward? And one scientist says, well, sure, that's obvious. And also, I looked at a lot of decision theory. There's so much knowledge out there. And people make decisions more on the edges than you would know. We draw our pro-con lists. Sometimes we don't always know. Like even to think about getting married, isn't there like a leap on the edge? People often don't respond to, here is the perfect partner that the computer and your parents say is for you. So we did spiritual values. And I remember even saying something like, and these people are very conservative. I also wanted to interact with some of the women who are definitely farming and business managers, but they don't want to be addressed as the farmer. So we talked about some of the aesthetic aspects of controlling ammonia with maybe planting these hedgerows, a very ancient technology that we're starting to understand. Oh, there's some environmental benefits to hedgerows. They weren't just accidental fences. And it was pretty amazing. And I also want to say, I love my colleagues, my science colleagues, and they're kind of like, okay, they think it's kind of cute and aesthetic and like very poetic. But do you know who keeps downloading my dissertation chapters? People in Europe, Germans. Germans love a theory. So the Germans are going, would you come and speak to our fighter association meeting? And I go, I really can't. Also COVID, but that's kind of a long story to say. Yeah. I would say regionally, I was able to do it. And that doesn't mean that you have to be rural to talk to rural. But it's a little bit like focus groups should lead you to places of shared values and ways to make trust. And that was just one way to get there. And your daughter can think of all of these ways of how do we initiate trust? And one of the lessons is it takes a lot of time and probably some face-to-face experiences. And also I went in with rubber boots on poultry houses, much harder than being around dairy cows. But that kind of immersion is probably really helpful.
And you were able to bring out the real lived experiences of the people you were trying to influence, and you were able to find out what made them tick and find a way to have this program respond in a way that they would appreciate.
Yeah, and I would also say, even though I'm very voluble, it was a discipline for me to just be the best listener I could and then come home and like go into a tape. Because if I sat there with the even act of writing, people are like this, right? We're being recorded.
Yeah, right. So,
and it could work at an impressionistic level, right? And I would just take a lot of notes. And it is something I try to communicate to my students, that there's no substitute for digging deep down in yourself and imagining your audiences and trying to make an utterly human connection.
I'm just, in listening to this, I'm thinking about expanding from the world of poultry farms on the Eastern Shore to our inability, it seems, to talk to each other across political divides anymore. Is there a set of practices that you would encourage people in order to kind of rebuild trust?
Yeah, so let me speak out of my own pain, and this is not unusual. People in this country and people in the world are all noting losses in families and communities. And sometimes it's so painful that, and I also think this is a thing culturally in many Irish families, the cutting off. And it happens everywhere, but I have Italian friends who don't do that. Okay. There's a kind of a different family culture that doesn't permit that, although I think times now are stressing that. I've actually been reading quite a bit by psychologists about that. And one thing is to stay in communication. I'm one of 7 children. Pretty sure 4 people voted for Trump once. I mean, I know they did. You know how people were more silent the second time, but others did. It's bad. It's bad between us. And the next generation of nieces and nephews will sometimes call or text and go, "Hi, I love you." And I just go, "I love you too. Tell me what you're up to." I think we need to stay in communication. And in one situation with one person, going to the family memories is really important because that's our shared history. Our parents are both gone. I have the advantage of being the oldest of 7. This person happens to be toward the tail end. And I know things like, well, you know, Dad used to sing a made-up song about Brian Boru marching in, and that's where your name comes from. And he goes, "How does it go?" And I go, "I don't know, because it was Dad's own song. But I can sing Kevin Barry to you." I mean, that's, again, finding the humanity. And I also think we have to be really careful about when people are going to breadcrumb back. Like you see that so-and-so, I don't know, who's one of them? George Conway is now a never Trumper. He has the complexity of his family division. But, you know, there are people who yell at him. And I just kind of want to go, we just have to stop that. That's an indulgence you can go have privately about your own righteous anger. And then there's nothing other than holding hands and making a coalition. And what we have happening now in the Middle East reminds us that we never can have the indulgence of not somehow being together about what is humane in the world and what we want.
You mentioned humane and the human dimension a lot in the last few moments. So it's hard to have these kinds of conversations right now without the term AI coming into the mix. What does artificial intelligence do to your world? Are there some pluses? Is it frightening?
It's terrifying. But I also want to say I've been paying attention to it for a really, really long time, because if you teach engineers, you know, a quarter of my classes, University of Maryland is one of the first accredited standalone comp sci schools. And I've got these kids. And by the way, it's not coding anymore. It's algorithms and databases that are not just the texts that we produce go into those databases. It's the algorithms of ranking. And some of their ranking is called sentient analysis, where an AI tries to say, this is a neutral paragraph. This is a warm paragraph. This is a paragraph of despair. Okay. So they are mining our stuff, not just for the words, but they're trying to look at our emotions. And there are some good uses. For example, there were early AIs that on Twitter and Instagram could start to say where someone was posting enough in a row of posts that could look like despair and maybe towards suicide. Now, how we operate on that knowledge is really hard to figure out, but, you know, that's possibly an incredible value when you think about the harm that Instagram does to young people. Ones that's more documented is young girls and feeling like they could never be thin or beautiful enough. So it's really tricky, but it's exploded this year because of ChatGPT coming on. Right. I'm often telling my colleagues, you know what? We have to be with this, because this is going to be a writing, what we call a generative technology. And I wish that we could do things like teach students, okay, here's a prompt, and this is what you get. Do you like that? Is this what you want to represent your thinking? Or could it be a draft that we change? And could it be a draft that we challenge? Because there's a lot of error and frank, what's the word? Mistruths. They call them hallucinations, which is a very funny word. But I did this with a friend. I said, have an AI write a biography of you. And I had the AI write a biography of me. I have a big web footprint, but he's younger. There's a bigger web footprint on him. It said that he had played professional baseball for a while. So the AI had made a prediction, based on his high school stats and the fact that many people leave high school to go play professional baseball. College is not necessarily the route. High school can be the route, kind of like with some basketball players. Anyway, he just went, what? Oh my God, I would have loved to have played professional baseball. But everything else in it was correct. It said something about his status. It also said something that made him say, oh my God, she's going to be upset. It wrote, his lovely and accomplished wife, named her. And he went, she's this major force in her field, and she doesn't want to be amended as the lovely wife. Anyway, so we need to do it. The thing that is really scary to me, and it's a question of scale, and it's above my pay grade, and his last name is Italian, but you guys need to have Vince Scafaria on to talk thoughtfully about this. Martin, I think there's some Irish in there, right?
I don't know. He has a fondness.
Who is this?
It's a mutual friend. He has a fondness, at least for decent Irish beer, I would say. So maybe we'll make him an honorary Irish one.
But isn't the definition of Irish, whoever is, well, I'm not going to say he's obsessed with Irishness, but
yeah.
Anyway, the scale and the speed of which this is coming at us, and let's be clear, and I would say as an environmental science, because we do ecosystem work, it's ultimately systemic. Malign actors and even stupid people with a lot of money and power have co-opted places, and they've pushed on a button and they go, whoa, look at that. These are these asynchronetic effects, or sometimes what we call positive feedback loops, or in my case, I'd say these are completely negative feedback loops. We're in some peril. And then going back to the ancestry and genealogy thing, and I don't believe any longer that spiritual ancestors are in heaven looking down at me. I wish I did. Oh my God, it would be comforting. But I do want to say, when I think about what people in the world, the majority of the people in the world now endure on a daily basis, and clearly what the Irish diaspora and the reasons for the diaspora, I tend to say, okay. And then Viktor Frankl said it. In most moments, we must pray that we can continue to choose our humanity in every moment. And as someone who was in a concentration camp, and he says, okay, one of my lessons was I want to be able to hold up how to be human there and study that, and also study the people who weren't able to, so we kind of help them.
Speaking of religion, we refer to it early on in this episode. As I understand it, you've stepped away from that, and that seems kind of so central to your thinking. So what happened there? Can you tell us about that?
Sure. I mean, I can say two things, and it's my personal story, so I get to say it. Divorce after 27 years, just devastating. And it's devastating for everyone, but, in Irish Catholic land, or Catholic land of most kinds, it has an additional level of trouble. And what I found out, which was kind of shocking, is that in my local parish, among human beings and even two priests, and we had a lot of priests around here because of Catholic U. There's no priest shortage in Washington, D.C., I promise you. But I remember sitting there and going, I don't think that's correct theology. Like, for me to say, there's nothing wrong with me being divorced. I may go to communion. I'm not in sin because I'm divorced. And it was this old-fashioned and wrong, theology that is also related to, especially in my particular parish, we have we have a very schismatic, anti-Francis, alt-right parish in my neighborhood. And do you know what? That offends me so much. And I was personally so hurt by that I just sort of said, I don't need to go anymore. And I don't. And you're right. It's a huge Catholic identity. You know who was more upset than almost anyone else? Because I slunk away. I didn't really tell people. Didn't even tell many of my family members. You notice how you can tell strangers things, but you don't always tell your family members? It's just like, nobody's the boss of me. But Washington is also an area, Maryland and Washington have very deep Catholic roots and very present Jewish roots of all levels of practice. And some of my Jewish friends were more upset than I was. And I remember having long, comforting conversations with them. And one of the things I took away, and I would say it to all of us, is you're Catholic. No one can make you not Catholic. And Jews accept a variety of practices, right? Strict Orthodox, Lubitcher Orthodox, reconstructed, even unaligned with women pastors and doing sort of like neo-pagan Jewish bar mitzvahs. Yeah. They say privately we might have a few things to say, but they accept one another as Jews. And I kind of lead with that. But it's really hard to peel apart. And I don't know what Ireland is like now. My siblings, except for one, are really very observant still. And they're upset. And I get told things. And I even totted it up once. I think I'm in mortal sin, maybe 300 and more times because I haven't been to Mass. I'll accept that.
Yeah. So what I tell people about Ireland now, especially to Irish Americans of Catholic background, that the country has changed so dramatically in the last 30 to 40 years, actually really since I came to the United States. So I left a country that was primarily very heavily observant in their practice of Catholicism. And now, if anything, it has gone the absolute opposite direction. It has changed totally. So yeah, it's in my experience, the Irish American Catholicism is more consistent in its practice than that of the home country, so to speak.
I think that's probably true. I would also say that living in D.C., it's also a hotbed of Catholic justice activity. And I have been protesting mostly with nuns and not as many priests, but always nuns. But, the nuns are dying, and several nuns in my world are dead. And I really, really miss them. But been sort of protesting and or doing very basic justice work. And I have loved that part of living here. I feel like I need to reflect Jesus, and I need to act like a person formed with Catholic social teaching, which also has a huge labor heritage. So I'll face whatever I face. But it is a grief to me. It is a grief to me.
Marybeth, we're heading towards the famous Seamus plug segment, but I wanted to ask you one other question before we get there, because I mentioned in the beginning the word global, that I would get back to it. And we love the global Irish nation. We have a lot of global conversations, and you talked about, being invited to Germany to speak and that kind of thing. In looking up technical writing, I came across the term, which I hadn't encountered before, of global English, and the need to be able to write in a way that can communicate to people for whom English is not their first language. Is that a thing? Is that something that you?
It is a thing, and I use it mostly in my class to caution human beings who are going to be bosses and colleagues to discredit both the spoken and written English of their immigrant colleagues, who are usually 2 and 3 language speakers, and that science goes across nations, as you know, and that we do have some experience with global English. Like I show them what air traffic control English is. It's sort of verb-driven commands, very simple English, and it's meant to what? Well, we're all speaking English, and we're going to go air flap down, wheel, lock, jammed, cannot, but you don't go, hey, I'm in some trouble. I really need a. So, yes. And also, English is rich because it's an Anglo-Saxon root with, oh my God, discursions in Romance languages through Latin, and French because of medieval French because of William the Conqueror, so English is already rich because it is a global language, and that we should not go after somebody because they get their subject verbs wrong. So yes, and at the same time, we human beings go, you should use a semicolon there. Where were you raised? And I try to say, nope, if that's your last hill, I don't know. Please don't be involved in international Indian stuff.
I'm not a fan of semicolons. I tried not to use them as much as possible.
There's a period.
So let's bring on Shameless Plug. Marybeth, it's been great talking with you. We'd love to know what you'd like to promote to our listeners. What should they know more about you or something you're very involved in?
So what I want to say is that I live in Maryland, and in Maryland, tribal communities disappeared or slunk into edge places, including intermarriage with very poor white indentured people and also African-American people. And I've thought a lot about it, and I've thought a lot about Catholicism's role in that because Maryland was founded as a Catholic colony. So I really care about indigenous stuff. I know that word doesn't sound right. And I was raised to know about it. And I would also say people in my family are a little surprised when I remind them that our dad and our mom and one side of our grandparents talked about what in effect was reparations for tribal communities. Because my family's history is mostly Indian land grab, right? And I say to them, well, the way you kind of were raised to think about this, you might want to think about reparations or distributive justice or some sort of acknowledgement of wealth in this country created upon theft of labor. So I care about that quite a bit. I want to mention a book that I think is really helpful. I think I mentioned that none of my siblings, including myself, none of us married Irish people, or even like 1/4. Everyone was not. And so we're a beautiful American stew, okay? And I think that's why our identity might be a little faded. But there's this book that my mom gave to each of us, like when we were engaged, people who were not Irish, and it's called Ethnicity and Family Therapy. And it's written by an Irish woman who was associated with Notre Dame, by Monica McGoldrick. And I actually love that book. Also, I think Richard Rodriguez's book called The Hunger of Memory, because when I moved to California, I wasn't ethnic, but Mexican people were. And so were Armenian people and Portuguese people. And I think that book was helpful to me. And I have Mexican nieces and nephews. So that book, I love that book. It's also about Catholic identity.
And so with that, Marybeth Shea, thank you for taking time out of your day to tell us a little bit about your Mountain West story and your Chesapeake Bay story. It's been a real pleasure, lots of food for thought, and encouragement of the virtue of the humanities and how it connects to science and how it allows us to connect between people. And ultimately, that's what makes life most worth living, is the connection that we have with each other. So thank you.
Thanks, Marybeth.
Thank you both.
John, that was a great conversation with Marybeth, and I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to speak to somebody that has had that Montana experience, or at least the Irish American Montana experience. And of course, she knows an extraordinary amount about her family history. The level of tales that she has reflects this very broad Irish experience about people showing up in all sorts of odd places, whether they come through the port of New Orleans or more traditional ports, let's say, of New York or Boston or Philadelphia, or even down through Canada and in through Chicago. She has it all in her family tree. And so it was really interesting to hear that and the odd confluence of the different cultures that set up shop in Montana, whether it was the French nuns that taught Marybeth during her earlier education, or the Native American tribes that she got exposure through her father's work. It's a very rich, a very different experience, and wholly Irish American.
Yeah, it certainly showed the kind of cross currents of cultures that the Irish were exposed to when they came over here. And by the time they made their way out to Butte, Montana, and that area that people don't realize is such a huge Irish area in the United States. And personally, I was interested, as I do public relations for a living, that kind of writing. I was interested to hear her experience in technical writing, sometimes called technical communications. Interesting approach to you have to translate very arcane, difficult information into language that people can understand. And I wonder if that maybe is another way where the Irish storytelling vibe emerges in a different format.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.